She was carrying flowers when she heard it. Pale winter roses from the conservatory, the ones she had cut herself that morning with the small silver shears her mother had pressed into her hands on her wedding day, because the head gardener, old Fenn, had mentioned in passing that they had been the late Duchess's favorite, and Maren had thought, with the particular stubborn hopefulness that she was beginning to understand, was her most dangerous quality, that perhaps they would make Evander look up from his morning correspondence and see her standing there. Not see through her, the way he generally did. Not register her presence the way you registered furniture, peripheral, useful, unremarkable. See her. She had given herself no illusions about the gesture. She was not a woman who trafficked in romantic fictions. She had simply decided, for the 4th or 5th time since the new year, to try something small and sincere and see what it produced. She was crossing the long corridor that ran alongside the East Library when his voice reached her through the door. It was ajar, only by an inch or two, just enough for the warmth of the fire inside to escape into the corridor and for his words to travel with it, unhurried and carrying the ease of a man who believed himself entirely unheard. She was not certain, later, that she would have stopped at all if he had not said her name. Maren manages the house well enough. I will say that for her. A pause. The soft sound of brandy being poured. The tenants speak well of her. She has never once embarrassed me in company. Damning praise? That was Caius Thorne, Evander's oldest friend, who had arrived from London the previous afternoon. His voice carried the dry warmth of 20 years of friendship. I do not mean it as such. Evander's tone was perfectly even, the tone of a man discussing something he had already decided and saw no reason to revisit. She is exactly what was presented. Dutiful, composed, entirely without the capacity to surprise me. A brief silence, then, as casually as if remarking on the condition of the North Road, I intend to tolerate the arrangement until she produces an heir. After that, I imagine we shall each find our own equilibrium quite naturally. Caius laughed. Not unkindly. The laugh of a man who has heard his friend say something he considers predictable. And then Evander laughed too, low and unhurried. The unguarded laugh of a man who had no idea his wife was standing 6 feet away in the corridor, learning, in the space of 2 sentences, precisely what she was worth to him. The roses left her hands. She did not hear them hit the floor. She did not hear anything for a long moment, only the sound of her own breathing, which she kept very careful, very quiet, the breathing of a woman who had decided in the space of a single heartbeat that she would not make a sound. She felt the stone wall beneath her palm, cold through her sleeve. The roses lay on the floor at her feet, pale and still lovely, and entirely unaware that they had been cut for a purpose that no longer existed. The corridor light was gray and thin and entirely appropriate. Tolerate, until she produces an heir. Inside the library, Caius said something she could not make out, and Evander responded, and their voices moved on to other subjects with the easy fluency of men who had said everything they needed to say about the matter and found nothing in it that required further examination. 12 months. She counted them, because counting was something concrete to do, something to occupy the part of her mind that would otherwise be doing something she could not afford. 12 months of rising before the household and learning the character of each room in this enormous, beautiful, indifferent house. 12 months of memorizing the names and circumstances of every one of his 340 tenants, not because it was expected of her, but because she had decided early that she would be a duchess worth having, that she would earn her place through something more than the accident of a well-negotiated settlement. 12 months of careful dinners, at a table long enough to seat 30, with the 2 of them positioned at opposite ends of it, like bookends on a shelf that had never held the same books. 12 months of discovering that he took his tea, scalding and black without sugar, that he preferred east-facing rooms in winter, that the slight tightening around his eyes when she ventured an opinion he had not invited meant he was choosing patience rather than engagement, which was not the same thing as listening, but was at least the shape of courtesy. All of it trying. She had given up her watercolors in the 3rd month, not because he had asked her to. He would never ask such a thing. He was too correct for it. But she had noticed, or imagined she had noticed, that the light from the west sitting room fell across his reading chair at an angle that could not have been restful, and she had thought, with the uncomplicated logic of a woman who wanted to be kind, that moving her painting materials to another room was a small thing. Easy. The kind of concession that cost nothing and might, in the accumulation of many such concessions, eventually build something. She could see now that this was not how it worked. You could not accumulate concessions into warmth. You could only accumulate concessions into the quiet conviction that you were worth less than you had thought, and that the distance between what you had hoped for and what you actually had was something you had earned by not being enough of whatever he had wanted. She had come into this marriage with something she had been too sensible to call hope. She had called it pragmatism instead, the willingness to work with what was given and build, slowly and without drama, something that might in time resemble partnership. She was good at patience. She had believed, as a matter of quiet principle, that effort and honesty were things another person could not fail to notice eventually. She bent down and picked up the roses from the floor, one by one, with hands that she made steady through an act of will she was too shaken to feel proud of. She held them and looked at them. Still lovely, still blushing faintly at the outer petals, still carrying the green cold smell of the conservatory, where they had grown unhurried and unobserved through the winter. She had cut them this morning because she had wanted to try again, because she was, apparently, constitutionally incapable of not trying. From inside the library, she heard Kaya say something that made Evander respond with a quiet sound of agreement, and she realized that the conversation had moved on entirely, and that whatever she was standing in this corridor feeling did not exist for either of them. It existed only for her in this small private disaster of a moment that would never appear in any accounting of the marriage. She turned and walked back the way she had come. Not quickly. She refused quickly. She moved at her usual pace, the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman with somewhere to be who was in no particular distress about getting there, and she passed the portrait gallery without looking at the long row of former Duchesses of Stormvale, each of them rendered in oils with expressions ranging from serene to resigned, and she passed the formal dining room and the window overlooking the frozen lake and the morning room door, and she went to the conservatory because it was warm there and smelled of living things, and she sat down on the small iron bench among the overwintering plants, and she laid the roses across her knees, and she thought. She could confront him. It was a simple enough decision to imagine. She could walk back to that library door and open it, and let Evander Cray see on her face what his words had produced. He would be horrified. He was too well-bred not to be. He would produce an apology, precisely worded and entirely sincere in its correctness, and Caius would find a reason to look elsewhere, and Evander would be more careful in future about where he said such things. And absolutely nothing would change. He would close back over it the way cold water closes over a dropped stone, smooth and undisturbed, and she would be left in precisely the same place she was now, except with the additional humiliation of having let him see that she cared. She would not do that. She looked at the roses in her lap. She looked at the glass walls of the conservatory, fogged with warmth against the January cold, and the bare garden beyond them, and the pale sky above that. She thought about the woman she had been attempting to be for 12 months, the careful, accommodating, quietly hopeful woman who cut flowers for a husband, who did not notice them and surrendered rooms without being asked, and told herself that patience was not the same thing as erasure. She could leave her here, not the house, not the marriage. Nothing as dramatic or impossible as that. But this particular version of herself, this woman who had been trying so hard to be loved that she had forgotten to simply be. She could leave her on this bench among the overwintering plants and become something else. Something that gave him exactly what the contract required, and precisely nothing more. If she was going to be tolerated, she would be tolerated on her own terms. She set the roses on the bench beside her. They would brown within a day without water. She found she could not bring herself to do anything about that. She stood, smoothed her skirts with steady hands, and walked toward the stairs. That evening she wore the deep blue gown that she had not worn since before the marriage because it drew attention, and she had spent 12 months trying to take up no more space than necessary. Tonight, she did not think about space. She came downstairs at exactly the appointed hour, took her place at her end of the long table, and was everything he had named her: composed, pleasant, efficient. She answered where answering was expected. She smiled at Caius Thorne's observations about London, which were genuinely amusing, and agreed with what required agreement, and contributed to the conversation with the precise calibration of a woman who knew exactly how much of herself she was choosing to reveal and had chosen very little. It cost her nothing. That was the revelatory part. All the effort she had spent calibrating and adjusting and trying had produced nothing that this effortless surface could not replicate exactly. She looked at Evander twice during the meal. Both times she found him looking back, not the usual glancing acknowledgement of a man registering the general presence of his wife. Something more deliberate than that, something that had a question at the back of it, though she could not have said what the question was, and did not particularly intend to answer it. She returned to her wine. After dinner, she wished them both a pleasant evening, and climbed the stairs to her rooms, and closed the door, and stood at her window in the dark, looking at nothing, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could name, entirely and completely herself. Which was, she thought, the strangest and most terrible discovery the day had produced. She had not understood, until she stopped trying, how completely the trying had unmade her. 3 days settled into the pattern she had decided upon, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that it held. She rose at her usual hour. She managed the household with the same attentive efficiency she had always brought to it, because the household had nothing to do with her feelings about Evander, and the tenants were not responsible for what she had heard in that corridor. She rode out across the estate each morning on the gray mare she had bought herself in September, because Evander's stables ran to hunters, and she had no interest in horses bred only for speed. She returned calls, supervised menus, wrote correspondence, received the housekeeper's reports. She performed every function of a Duchess of Stormvale with the same competence she had always had, but without the invisible weight of wanting it to mean something. That weight, she discovered, had been enormous. She had not known it was there until it was gone, the way you do not understand how much a headache costs you until it lifts and you can think cleanly again. The low, constant vigilance of a woman trying to be enough had been so familiar that she had mistaken it for simply being herself. Now, without it, she moved through the house with a lightness she had not felt since before her wedding day, and she found this more unsettling than the grief had been. The grief had made sense. The lightness required a different kind of reckoning. She took her watercolors back to the west sitting room on the second morning. She carried them from the morning room, where she had stored them, and set up her board at the window, with a good light, and she painted for 2 hours without thinking about whether she was inconveniencing anyone. The view from that window was the frozen lake and the bare tree line beyond it, and she worked on the quality of light on the ice, the way it was neither silver nor white, but something in between that required mixing, and she was absorbed enough that she did not hear footsteps in the corridor until they stopped. Evander was in the doorway. She did not startle. She finished the stroke she was making and looked at him with the pleasant composure she had decided was the only expression she would allow herself in his company, and said, "Good morning." He looked at the painting board, at the paints arranged on the small table beside her, at the window, then at her. "I did not know you painted," he said. She held his gaze very steadily. "I have painted since I was 9 years old." Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. He had not known, because she had been doing it in the morning room for the better part of 9 months, since she had quietly removed herself from this room to avoid inconveniencing him, and he had not noticed the absence. She watched him absorb this without being certain he had understood it. He was an intelligent man, but intelligence did not guarantee attention, as she had some evidence of by now. "Of course," he said, and left. She turned back to the window. The light on the ice was precisely as she had been working on it, patient and pale, and not yet fully resolved. She allowed herself to feel nothing about the conversation at all, which took slightly more effort than she would have preferred. The fourth day brought a letter from her cousin Petra, written in the sprawling, energetic hand of a woman who thought in paragraphs and had no patience for brevity. "Dearest Maren, I am coming to Stormvale. I have already written to your husband, because I knew you would say yes, and saw no reason to wait for formality. I arrive in a fortnight. I am bringing the spaniel. I am also bringing my unfiltered opinions, and I expect to be properly housed and lavishly entertained. Your affectionate and entirely self-invited cousin, Petra." Maren read it twice, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, with some relief, as uncomplicated joy. Petra Aldwell was the only person in the world who knew her without effort, the way some people know the back of their own hand, without having to think about it, or navigate it, or make it comfortable for anyone. She was warm and loud and wickedly observant, and she would take one look at Maren and know, without being told, that something had shifted, and she would not let that go unexamined. Under normal circumstances, Maren would have found this prospect faintly alarming. Right now, she found it necessary in the way that water was necessary. She wrote back immediately. "Come as soon as the roads allow. Come faster than that." That evening at dinner, she told them. Caius brightened at the mention of Petra's name, which Maren noted, but did not remark on. Evander listened with the contained attention he brought to domestic information, the expression of a man filing things in the appropriate mental location. "She will want the blue suite," he said after a moment. She said the view from it suited her on her last visit. Maren looked at him. He had remembered. A passing preference expressed by a guest 18 months ago before their marriage, and he had retained it. She turned this fact over carefully, the way you turn over something that might be significant and might simply be the unremarkable operation of a good memory, and she decided that she did not know which it was, and that it did not change what she had heard through the library door regardless. "That would be very kind," she said. "Thank you." She returned to her dinner. Her hands beneath the table were not entirely steady, and she found she resented him for that. The smallest, most involuntary crack in the composure she had decided upon, produced by something as simple as a remembered guest suite. One detail, one retained, considerate detail. It was not enough to weigh against tolerate, and until she produces an heir. She knew that. She was entirely certain she knew that. But she lay awake that night for a long time, and the ceiling above her bed offered no useful counsel at all. Evander Cray had built his life on the premise that he understood most things. He understood estates and parliament, and the particular arithmetic of alliance that moved legislation through the lords with the quiet efficiency of a well-maintained machine. He understood horses, accounts, and the difference between the silence of a man who needed to be left alone and the silence of a man waiting, with increasing difficulty, to be asked. He did not understand what had happened to his wife. He had not understood her before this past week either. But the oversight had not troubled him, because he had not been paying attention. He had looked across the dinner table every evening and registered her presence the way you registered reliable fixtures: present, functional, unremarkable. Now he was looking closely and finding himself several weeks behind whatever he was looking at. She was the same on the surface. She said the right things and fulfilled every function of her position with the same quiet competence. She was not cold or rude or distant in any way he could name. She was simply not available in some register he had not previously noticed was there, and the absence produced in him the unease of someone who reaches for something in its expected location and finds the space empty. He mentioned it to Caius the morning before Caius departed for London, in the oblique way of a man who wants to raise a subject without appearing to raise it. "Marin seems," he began, and stopped, because he did not have a word that was accurate, without also being more revealing than he intended. Caius had known him for 20 years, and was not deceived by the oblique approach. "Different?" he offered. "Something of that nature." "Different how?" Evander looked out the window at the grounds, where his wife was at that moment crossing the lawn toward the stables in her pine-colored coat, moving with the unhurried purpose that he was realizing, somewhat late, was characteristic of her. "I cannot say precisely." "Have you asked her?" He looked at his friend. "Right," Caius said, with the particular neutrality that meant he had several more things to say, and was choosing not to say them in this moment. He reached for his hat. "I will offer one observation before I go, and then it is your problem, and not mine. Whatever you believe you have in that house, Evander, make certain you actually have it, before you spend 20 years acting as though you do." He left. Evander stood at the window and watched the carriage go down the drive, and did not immediately move. The house was quieter with Caius gone. It had always been quieter than it should have been, the silence of two people occupying the same space, with careful, elaborate courtesy, and very little else. He had not found it oppressive before. He found it oppressive now. On the third morning after Caius's departure, he went to the west sitting room for a book he had left there, and found Marin at the window with her painting, and he stopped in the doorway because she had not heard him, and he had a moment, unobserved, to look at the scene properly. She was entirely self-contained. She sat with the posture of a woman comfortable in her own company, the brush moving in small, certain strokes, her attention given wholly to the work before her. She was not performing composure the way she sometimes was at dinner, the quality of pleasant attention that he had begun to recognize as a deliberate construction. This was simply her, unobserved, and she looked, he thought with some discomfort, considerably more at ease than she ever looked in his presence. "What are you painting?" he asked. She turned without startling and tilted the board slightly toward him. The frozen lake, the pale tree line, the particular quality of January light on ice. It was good, better than good. There was genuine understanding in it, the way the light sat on different textures differently, something that could not be taught, and was simply either present in a person or not. "You have a gift for light," he said, because it was true, and he had been raised to say true things. She looked at him directly then, with those gray eyes that he was beginning to understand were considerably more observant than he had given them credit for being. "Thank you," she said. Composed. Pleasant. Returned immediately to her work. He found his book and left, and stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was necessary, with the inconvenient sensation of a man who has been living in a house for a year and has only just noticed that one of its rooms contains something worth looking at. That afternoon, the post arrived. Among the letters was a card from a Lord Florian Voss, newly returned from the continent, who had taken the lease on Chetwell Park 4 miles east, and wrote to introduce himself to his neighbors. He enclosed a separate note for the Duchess, which the footman brought to Marin in the morning room. Evander did not ask what it said. He was in the study when the footman returned, and he went back to his correspondence, and he was doing very well at not thinking about it until he passed the morning room door 20 minutes later and saw Marin reading the note at her writing desk. She smiled, the involuntary, genuine kind, there and gone in a moment. Evander walked on. Florian Voss. The name stayed at the edge of his attention for the rest of the afternoon. He did not know the man. He was already certain he was going to find that inconvenient. Florian Voss arrived on a Thursday, which Petra later said she had known would be significant, because Thursdays were the kind of day when unexpected things happened, a theory Maren found entirely without logic, but chose not to argue with, because Petra's theories about the days of the week were a permanent feature of her character, and not something that responded well to rational counter-argument. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 32, with the particular ease of a man who had spent 3 years on the continent acquiring a Polish that English society generally took a decade to produce. He had dark eyes and a quick, apparently genuine smile, and he arrived with excellent manners and a box of Italian chocolates for the Duchess, which he presented with such uncomplicated warmth that Maren's first coherent thought was simply, "This is what it feels like when someone is actually pleased to meet you." She brought him to the drawing room. Petra was already installed there with her spaniel, who inspected Florian's boots with the thoroughness of a customs official, and Florian crouched down to greet the dog with the unself-conscious ease of a man entirely unbothered by animals, which made Petra give Maren a fractional lift of her eyebrow that meant she was reconsidering her initial assessment. He noticed the landscape above the fireplace almost immediately. "This is quite extraordinary," he said, moving closer to look at it with the focused attention of someone who actually knew how to look at paintings, not the polite, performative attention of someone going through the motions. "The handling of the light on that ice is unlike anything I have seen from the English school." He turned. "Who painted it?" "I did," Maren said. He looked at the painting again, then at her, with the uncomplicated delight of a person who has discovered something unexpected and is genuinely pleased about it, rather than simply obliged by courtesy to appear so. "I spent 3 years in Florence," he said. "In that time, I met perhaps 4 painters who understood winter light the way this does. You have a real gift, Duchess." She had been told this before. Evander had said it, standing in the doorway of the West sitting room, in a tone she had spent several days trying and failing to categorize. But Florian said it differently. He said it as though it mattered that she knew. They talked, and the talking had more weight and direction than the usual careful excavations of a first acquaintance. He told her about Florence and the particular quality of October light over the Arno, which she had never seen and could easily imagine, and about Chetwell Park and his plans for the kitchen gardens and the south-facing wall, on which subject she had opinions that she offered plainly, and he listened with his full attention, and then disagreed with one of them on grounds that were actually intelligent. The disagreement was the thing that convinced her he was real. People performing attention agreed with everything and waited for the next opportunity to seem interested. Florian Voss argued with the comfortable confidence of someone who assumed she was capable of holding her own, and she found, to her quiet relief, that she still was. Petra watched all of this from her chair by the window, with the particular expression she used when she was cataloging information for later examination. Evander arrived at 20 minutes past 4. She heard his voice in the hallway first, the unhurried, authoritative tone of a man returning to his own house, and then he came through the drawing room door and stopped, barely perceptibly, as he took in the scene. Florian rose and extended his hand, with the confidence of a man comfortable in any room. "Duke of Stormvale, Florian Voss. I have taken Chetwell Park." "Mr. Voss." Evander shook the offered hand. His gaze moved briefly to Maren, then back. "I have monopolized your wife for the better part of an hour," Florian said, with a smile that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and entirely unapologetic. "She has been very gracious." "My wife is generally gracious," Evander said, in a tone Maren could not immediately place, because it was not quite sarcasm, and not quite correction, and not quite anything she had heard from him before. Florian extended an invitation, a small dinner the following Friday at Chetwell Park, several of the local families, an easy evening to make himself known before the London season. He addressed the words to Evander, but he looked at Maren when he said them, the glance of a man who understood where the real answer would come from. "We should be glad to attend," she said. A pause. Then Evander. Of course. Florian stayed another quarter hour and left with the same warmth he had arrived with, and the room was quieter for his absence. In the specific way a room is quieter when someone genuinely animated has left it. Petra took the spaniel for a walk with the transparent purpose of a woman manufacturing a private conversation, and the door closed behind her. Evander remained. He stood near the window, looking at the landscape above the fireplace, with an expression Maren could not read, and she waited for whatever he intended to say. He is charming, he said finally, without inflection. Yes. You enjoyed the conversation. She met his gaze directly. I did. He is interesting and he listens, which is not as common as one might hope. She had not meant it as an accusation, but she did not retract it either. Another pause, long enough to have a shape. Good, he said. And left. She stood alone in the drawing room, holding the box of Italian chocolates, and turned over that single syllable the way you turned over a coin to discover which side faced up. Good. Not indifferent. Not dismissive. Not the brisk, functional monosyllable of a man moving on to the next item on his mental ledger. Something with a texture to it that she could not quite name, and the fact that she was examining it at all told her more about her current state than she particularly wanted to know. She set the chocolates on the table and went to stand by the window. The grounds were still and pale in the late afternoon light, the frozen lake a flat gray in the distance, and she looked at it without really seeing it, and thought about the fact that Florian Voss had spent 3 hours in this house and made her feel, for the duration of those hours, like a person worth the full attention of a room. When Petra returned, she sat across from Maren with the deliberate patience of a woman who had decided a conversation was going to happen properly. He stood in the doorway, she said without preamble, for 30 seconds before anyone noticed him. Your husband, watching you laugh at something Mr. Voss said. Maren did not ask what Evander had looked like, watching. One dinner, she said. At Chetwell Park. That is all it is. Petra smiled with the serenity of someone who already knew where things were going. Of course, she said. That is all. The dinner at Chetwell Park was a small, well-arranged affair. 8 people around a table that was exactly the right size for 8, which Maren noted as the first evidence of a host who actually thought about the mechanics of social comfort. Florian had invited the Pembroke family from the village, a retired naval captain and his wife, the local vicar and his quiet, observant wife, and Maren and Evander, and he had placed them all with the easy competence of a man who had been managing rooms for years. He seated Maren across from himself, which Evander noticed and said nothing about. The evening moved well from the start. The food was good, and the wine was better, and Florian was a host who managed the conversation the way a skilled conductor managed an orchestra, drawing out the quieter voices, redirecting the louder ones, ensuring no one felt invisible or forgotten. Maren found herself contributing more freely than she generally did at social occasions, her opinions offered with an ease she had nearly forgotten she possessed, and she was aware, in some peripheral way, that this was simply what happened when a room made you feel that what you said was wanted. It was Captain Hale, 3 seats down, who said something dismissive about the newer crop rotation methods, calling them fashionable nonsense without practical substance. And Maren, who had read extensively on the subject through the long Stormvale winters, because she had inherited her father's genuine interest in agricultural management, said pleasantly that she thought the evidence was more nuanced than that, and offered 2 specific examples. Captain Hale looked at her with the politely surprised expression of a man who had not anticipated specific examples from a young duchess. What my wife is referring to, Evander said from the other end of the table, with the calm certainty of a man who had been attending to every word spoken in that room, is the Linfield trials and the Ashworth comparison from the last agricultural review, both of which, as it happens, support her point rather precisely. There was a brief, recalibrating silence. Captain Hale conceded with good grace. The conversation moved on. Maren looked at her husband. He was already turned to Florian beside him, his expression attentive and composed, giving away nothing. But he had read the agricultural reviews. He had read them carefully enough to cite specific papers by name in support of an argument she was making, which meant he had been listening to her across that long table. On the evenings, she had assumed he was simply enduring. She did not know what to do with that, so she placed it in the part of her mind reserved for things that were potentially significant and required calm attention rather than immediate conclusions, and she finished her dinner. Florian watched the exchange with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, something attentive and slightly recalculated, and he said something warm and easy to Maren about her knowledge of the subject, and she thanked him, and the evening continued. Evander said nothing further on the topic, but Maren was aware, in the particular way she was becoming aware of things she had previously overlooked, that he was watching. Not watching Florian. Watching her, the way you watched something you were trying to understand and could not quite arrive at, and were not ready to stop trying. When Florian refilled her wine without being asked, and leaned slightly closer to hear what she was saying to Mrs. Pembroke on her left, and when Evander saw this and set his own glass down with a quietness that was somehow too deliberate to be entirely casual, she filed that too, in the same careful place, for later consideration. In the carriage home, with the dark pressing against the windows and only the sound of hooves on frozen road, Evander was quiet, and she was quiet, except that the quality of the silence was different tonight from what it had been in every carriage ride before it. She became aware of his hand on the seat beside her, not reaching for hers, simply resting on the leather an inch from her glove, close enough that she was aware of it, with a disproportionate, specific attention that made no sense and was entirely real. She did not move her hand. He did not move his. "You spoke well tonight," he said, quietly, to the window. She looked at him. Captain Hale was wrong. He was, and you knew it precisely, which is not the same as being willing to say so in company. He paused. "You generally are." She absorbed this. He had noticed that about her, specifically noticed it, and retained it, the way he had retained Petra's preferred guest suite and the contents of the agricultural journals. "You did not need to intervene," she said. "I was managing." "I know you were." Another pause. "I wanted to." She turned to look at him properly in the darkness. His expression was quiet and difficult to read, the expression of a man who has said something he meant and is waiting, without any obvious anxiety, to see what comes next. "Why?" she asked. He looked out the window. "Because you were right," he said, and did not elaborate, and the carriage rolled on, and the hooves were the only sound, until they reached Stormvale, and he handed her down from the carriage with his usual correct courtesy, and she went to her room. She sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. He had read the journals. He had wanted to defend her point. He had said her name in the corridor of the morning room last week, with a weight she had not been able to account for, and his hand had been an inch from hers on the carriage seat for 20 minutes, and neither of them had moved, and she was increasingly and inconveniently aware that she did not actually know what any of it meant. She thought about Florian Voss, who looked at her with open, uncomplicated attention, and made the wanting simple and clean and without consequence. She thought about how easy it had been, in his company, to remember what it felt like to simply be a person someone was glad to know. She thought about the inch of space on the carriage seat, his hand not reaching, simply there. The silence between them on the drive home, which had felt less like absence, and more like something she did not yet have the right word for. She did not reach any conclusion that was useful or safe, and eventually she went to bed. Florian called again the following week, on an afternoon when Evander was out riding the southern fields, and Petra had gone to the village. Maren received him in the morning room, poured the tea herself, and they talked comfortably for the first half hour about Chetwell Park, and a book he had brought from Florence, a collection of Italian landscape plates, which she did like and said so. It was the second 30 minutes that changed things. He asked, with the same easy warmth he brought to everything, about the Stormvale estate. The scale of the northern holdings, precisely. Whether the parliamentary seat attached to the dukedom gave Evander particular influence over the committee currently reviewing the northern enclosure bills. Whether she found the management of an estate this size demanding, and whether Evander consulted her on decisions or preferred to manage those matters himself. She answered the first two questions before she understood what she was answering. It was not any single question that revealed it. It was the pattern of them, the specific direction in which the warmth was being applied, the way the interest had a destination. She recognized it the way you recognized, midway through a conversation, that you were being led somewhere you had not agreed to go, and the recognition was quiet and clear and not particularly dramatic, which was almost worse. He was not interested in her opinion of kitchen gardens or Italian landscape painting, or what she thought about the rotation trials. He was interested in the reach of the parliamentary seat and the size of the northern holding, and she was the most convenient route to that information, and she happened to be pleasant company, which was useful rather than incidental. She looked at him across the tea table. He was still charming. His eyes were still warm, and his attention was still fully apparent, and none of that had changed. It simply meant something different than she had thought it meant. "The northern holdings are managed by our steward," she said, pleasantly and without emphasis. "And my husband's parliamentary interests are not something I am well placed to speak to. You would do better to ask him directly." Something shifted in his expression, brief and quickly recovered. "Of course," he said. "I did not mean to pry." "Not at all," she said, and meant it, and changed the subject with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 12 months managing conversations that needed redirecting. He left 20 minutes later with the same warmth he had always carried, and she sat in the morning room with the Italian landscape book in her lap and looked at the cover for a long time without opening it. She had wanted it to be real. That was the honest thing, the thing she owed herself the accuracy of acknowledging. She had wanted someone to look at her with genuine interest and find what was actually there, and Florian Voss had looked very much like that person, and she had allowed herself the comfort of it without examining it too carefully, and it had not been what she thought, and that was its own particular grief. Nothing catastrophic, nothing she could not carry, but grief regardless. The way the end of a thing you wanted is always grief, even if the thing was never quite yours. She heard Evander's horse on the drive 20 minutes later. He came to the morning room doorway, still in his riding coat, and she looked up. "Mr. Voss called this afternoon," she said. "He asked about the extent of the northern holdings and Evander's committee work. I told him he would need to speak to you." Something in Evander's expression went very still. "I am perfectly well," she said, before he could speak. "I am not in need of either an apology on his behalf or a lecture on my own judgment." "I was not going to offer either," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I was going to say," he stopped. His jaw worked. "I am sorry that you hoped for something genuine and found it was not." The simplicity of it reached her in a way she had not been prepared for, because she had been braced for something manageable, and this wasn't manageable. This was just accurate, and accuracy in this particular moment was its own kind of undoing. She looked at the book in her lap. "Thank you," she said. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. "He's not," he said carefully, "the only person in this house who has been paying attention." He left before she could answer. She sat for a long time after, the book unopened, the winter light shifting slowly across the floor, and she thought about what he had said and what he had not said. He is not the only person in this house who has been paying attention. She turned it over carefully, as she turned over everything now, because she had learned in the past weeks that the things she dismissed too quickly were often the things that mattered most, and she did not know, yet, What to do with a husband who had been paying attention all along and had simply not found a way to say so, and a version of herself that had stopped looking for the evidence. The conservatory was cold at midnight, not the biting cold of the grounds outside, which had been pressing against the glass all winter and settling at the margins of the room, but a different kind, the kind that accumulated in an unwatched space after the fires were banked and the household had gone to bed. Maren sat on the iron bench among the overwintering plants, with her knees drawn up, wrapped in the shawl she kept by her bedroom door for this kind of sleeplessness. She was not reading or painting, or she was sitting in the only room in Stormvale that smelled of living things and waiting for the quality of her thoughts to improve. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the outer corridor, the particular unhurried step of a man who was not in a hurry, and then a pause at the door, and then Evander came in carrying a candle. He was fully dressed, which meant he also had not been to bed, and he looked at her on the bench for a moment without saying anything. "You could not sleep," he said finally. "No." He came in and closed the door behind him, and set the candle on the potting bench, and sat down on the wooden stool beside it, which was not made for sitting on, and which he appeared not to notice. He looked around the room in the candlelight, at the overwintering ferns, and the bare rose canes, and the darkness pressing against the glass. "My mother used to come here," he said, "in the winters. She said it helped her think." She turned toward him. He had not spoken of his mother more than once in their marriage. She had learned the loss from his sister's letters, that she had died when Evander was 17, and she had stored the fact carefully in the particular place she kept things too important to approach without preparation. "Was she a gardener?" Maren asked. "No. She simply liked things that were alive." He paused. "She would have liked you, I think. She had opinions about drainage, and she was not embarrassed by them." The words settled in the candlelight with the weight of something unplanned. Maren looked at the rose canes. "Evander," she said, and stopped, because she had not yet decided what came next. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "What do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands rested loosely between his knees, and his eyes were on the floor with the expression of a man who was choosing his words more carefully than usual, but choosing them, not managing them. "That this is not what you hoped for," he said. "This marriage. That I have not been what you hoped for, and that I have known this for some time and said nothing about it, which is its own particular kind of failure." The directness of it was so unlike everything that had preceded it that she sat very still and waited to see if more was coming. "Caius told me, before he left, to make certain I had what I thought I had," he said. "I have been thinking about it since. What I concluded was that I have been managing this marriage the way I manage everything else, as a set of functions to perform correctly, and that you deserved considerably better than correct, and I was aware of that, and I chose correct anyway, because it was easier." She kept very still. "Why are you saying this now?" she asked. "Tonight." "Because it is midnight, and I am in the only room in this house that does not feel managed," he said simply, "and I am tired. I am tired of the distance I keep manufacturing, and I think you are tired of it too, and I don't want to spend another 12 months watching you be smaller than you are, because I was not willing to say a plain thing plainly." She looked at her hands. Then, because she was also tired of the surface of everything. "I cut those roses on the morning I overheard you in the library," she said. The room went very still. "I heard you tell Caius you intended to tolerate this marriage until I produced an heir," she said, quietly, because the words did not need volume. They had already done everything they were capable of doing, and that after that, we would find our own equilibrium. I was standing in the corridor with your mother's favorite flowers in my hands. He did not move. His face went through something she could not fully follow, something rapid and honest and not managed, and what remained was not composed. It was simply a man, on an uncomfortable stool in a cold room, reckoning with what he had done. "I left the roses here," she said. "I let them die. I decided that day to stop trying and to simply be adequate, since that appeared to be what was wanted." She looked at him directly. "I have been performing the marriage you described to your friend ever since. I thought you deserved to know that." He stood and crossed to her, and she could see that the management was entirely gone, that whatever was on his face now was not calibrated or performed. "I said something careless and cruel and called it pragmatic," he said. "And it wasn't pragmatic. It was the thing I told myself because what I actually felt was harder to say, and I was not yet brave enough to say it." He reached down and took both her hands, both of his around hers, in the dark. "You have not been adequate. You have never been adequate. You are the most thoroughly present person in this house, and I have been treating that as an inconvenience because it required something of me, and I am sorry." "I noticed the roses," he said quietly. "I found them in here, already brown. I knew you had cut them. I did not know how to say something about them without saying everything else, and I was not ready to say everything else." She turned to look at him. His face in the candlelight was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, and she understood that this was who he was underneath the management. This man who noticed brown roses and came to the conservatory at midnight and did not know how to say the plain thing until he had been driven to it. He leaned forward and kissed her. Not the dutiful kind, something entirely different, something that was an apology and a question and an admission all at once. And she sat very still for one heartbeat, and then kissed him back, because she was tired, and he was here, and some part of her had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting. When they separated, his forehead rested briefly against hers in the cold room. "This changes nothing," he said, in the voice of a man saying the careful thing, because he did not yet know how to say the true one. She looked at him in the candlelight. "I know," she said, and went inside. Morning came with the particular indifference of mornings after things that cannot be undone. She descended at her usual hour. Evander was already at the table with his correspondence, and rose when she entered, as he always did. He said good morning. She said good morning. She sat at her end of the table and poured her tea, and opened the letter from her father that had arrived with the post, and the meal proceeded exactly as every other breakfast of the past 12 months had proceeded, and the only evidence that anything had changed was the deliberate, effortful quality of the normalcy itself, the way perfectly ordinary behavior becomes visible when both people are consciously producing it. She ate her toast. She did not look at him more than politeness required. He turned pages. He did not look at her more than politeness required. She told herself this was the expected aftermath of a midnight conversation that had gone further than either of them had anticipated, and that time was a reasonable thing to allow. She was less prepared for the quality of the days that followed, which had the texture of a room where something has happened, and everyone is pretending to have been elsewhere. The correctness had intensified rather than diminished, and she understood by the third day that he was not retreating out of indifference, but out of the fear of a man who had said something large and did not yet know what to do with the size of it. She understood the fear. She did not find it sufficient. On the 5th day, Petra appeared in the morning room with a letter she had clearly already read, which was characteristic of Petra in situations she had decided required her direct involvement. "Mrs. Pembroke wrote to her sister in London," she said, without any preamble, setting the letter on the writing desk. "Said the Stormvale marriage was one of those arrangements. Said Voss had been paying you pointed attention at the Chetwell dinner. Said Evander looked uncomfortable about it." She paused. The sister shared it. Widely. Marin set down her pen. "Caius has apparently written to Evander already," Petra continued, "though I cannot tell you what he said." Marin looked at the window. Outside, the grounds were pale in the February light, the lake beginning to show the first faint dark lines at its edges, where the ice was starting to think about releasing. How much of it is untrue? Petra considered with her usual directness. The arrangement part is simply accurate. The Voss part is a selective truth. The part about Evander looking uncomfortable is, I believe, the most precise sentence in the letter. Maren looked at her cousin. What did you think when you saw it? I thought, Petra said carefully, that the county had observed something real and drawn an incorrect conclusion from it. What they saw was distance. What they do not know is that the distance has been closing. She paused. Has it been closing? After the conservatory? Maren was quiet for a moment. He has been very correct since. Correct is not closing. No, she agreed. But I think it is fear. I think he said things he meant, and did not know what to do with having meant them, and he has been managing the aftermath rather than acting on it. She paused. I am not willing to wait indefinitely for him to find his courage. Good, Petra said. I would be disappointed if you were. Florian called that afternoon. She had assumed, after the morning room conversation 3 weeks earlier, that he would allow things to settle. He arrived at 4 o'clock with the confidence of a man who had decided on a course of action, and the footman showed him in before anyone had a reason to redirect him. She received him in the drawing room, alone, and he was warm for 10 minutes, and then said, with the directness she had once found refreshing, I understand there is some talk in the county about the nature of your marriage. There is talk in every county about every marriage, she said pleasantly. I want you to know, he leaned forward slightly, that whatever your arrangement with Stormvale, you have options. A woman of your quality and intelligence should not spend her life in something that doesn't value her. She looked at him. She considered the questions he had asked about the parliamentary committee and the northern holdings, delivered with the warmth of genuine interest. She thought about what it felt like to believe you were being seen, and what it felt like to discover you were simply being assessed for what you represented. The Italian landscape book he had brought came to mind, beautiful and unopened in her lap, and what that had told her about the difference between a gesture and a thing. Thank you, Mr. Voss, she said pleasantly. I do not require alternatives, and I will tell you plainly that your interest in the estate's parliamentary position has been rather more visible than you may have intended. I am not offended, but I would ask that we dispense with the performance of concern. Something shifted in his expression, quickly recovered. You are more forthright than I expected. Yes, she said. I generally am. She offered her hand. I hope Chetwell Park suits you. He nodded with reasonable grace and left. Evander appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later. He looked at the empty room and at her sitting in it. He called, she said. He offered alternatives. I know. I heard him leave. He remained in the doorway. Did you consider them? She looked at her husband steadily. No. Then, before he could retreat into the studied normalcy of the past 5 days, Evander, we cannot go on with this. The conservatory happened. Things were said and something was done, and nothing has been addressed since, and I am not willing to continue as though it did not occur. She paused. I told you in the conservatory what I heard in the library. You told me things you have apparently not known how to say for 12 months. And then you said, it changes nothing, and you have been performing that statement ever since, and I think we both know it is not true. Something in his expression shifted, the particular quality she was beginning to recognize as the moment before honesty arrived. No, he said, quietly. It is not. He went to Florian Voss the following morning. Maren did not know this until Petra told her, and Petra had learned it from the groom who had seen Evander take the Chetwell Road at 9:30, which was not his usual route, and not his usual hour for riding. He was gone for nearly 2 hours. When he returned, he came directly to the morning room without removing his coat, which told her something about the urgency of whatever he had decided. I spoke to Voss, he said, She set down her brush. I did not ask you to. No. He remained standing, still in his outdoor coat, as though he had not decided to stay. I went because he has implied to you, twice now, that you were poorly served and that he could offer something better. He was not wrong about the first part. He was entirely wrong about the second, and I wanted him to understand that clearly. She waited. I told him that his interest in the estate's parliamentary connections had not been as subtle as he believed, Evander said, and that if he continued implying the Duchess of Stormvale was in any way available to alternative arrangements, I would make clear to every family in the county the precise nature of what he had been calculating since the day he arrived. He said he had no such intention. I suggested he make certain that remained the case. He paused. He asked me, before I left, whether I was defending my honor or defending my wife. I told him I was defending my wife. The room was very quiet. Petra had said to Maren that morning, quietly, while they were still at breakfast, "There is a difference between a man who defends his honor and a man who defends his wife. The first is protecting himself. The second is choosing her." She had said it without looking up from her letter, in the manner of a woman delivering information she considered relevant and leaving the recipient to make of it what she would. "Petra is astute," Evander said, when Maren relayed this. "She is." Maren looked at him carefully. "What did it cost you?" "To say those things to him." "To say them, I had to be clear about what you are to me," he said, meeting her eyes, "which meant being clearer about that than I have been to you. And that is not something I am proud of." He paused. "I told him you were not available to alternatives, of any description, because you are not a woman in an unfortunate arrangement who requires rescue. You are my wife, and I have been a poor one, and I intend to remedy that, and his particular variety of interest is not welcome here." She absorbed this. "Why did you tell Caius what you told him?" she asked. "The words about tolerating me. When you said them, did you believe them?" He was quiet for long enough that the answer was clearly not a simple one. "I told myself I believed them," he said, "because they required nothing of me. The honest answer is that I had married a woman I did not know how to approach, who was capable and patient and genuine, and who came into this house and tried every day to build something real, and I did not know how to deserve that trying. So I put a name on the marriage that made it something I did not have to try for." His voice was even, but she could hear the effort in the evenness. "I knew while I was saying it that it was a kind of cowardice. I chose it anyway." She stood. She crossed to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to him, looking at the grounds. The ice on the lake was definitely thinning now at the edges, the dark lines she had observed yesterday wider and more definite today. "You noticed the roses," she said. "You found them already brown, and you knew what it meant." "Yes." "And you said nothing." "I found them 3 weeks after you left them," he said. "I knew why they were there. I knew what it said about how long you had been trying and what it had cost you, and I did not address it, because addressing it would have meant addressing everything else, and I was not prepared for everything else." He paused. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I am telling you now because you asked me to tell you what was actually true rather than what was convenient." She turned to face him. "What was actually true," she said, "is what I need you to tell me. About everything. From the beginning. Not the managed version." She held his gaze. "I am asking you to be honest with me in the way you were honest with Voss this morning. About what you felt, and when, and what you chose to do about it, and why." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the decision being made, the familiar hesitation, and then the choice, the same choice she had watched him make in the conservatory at midnight, which seemed each time he made it to cost him slightly less than the time before. She thought, while she waited, about what she actually wanted from this conversation. Not the apology, which she had already received, not the partial explanation she had been gathering in pieces over these past weeks. She wanted the whole of it, the beginning and the middle, and the part that had produced 2 sentences in a library corridor. She wanted to understand who he had been then and who he was now. She thought she deserved that answer, and she intended to have it. She was not, she realized, afraid of what he might say. "Come inside," she said. "Take off your coat. Tell me." He told her. Standing in the morning room with the winter light flat and gray through the glass, without his coat now, without the studied neutrality of the past 12 months, he told her, and she listened without interrupting, because she understood that this was the thing she had been waiting for, and that interrupting it would only make it take longer to arrive. He had noticed her immediately, not in the way of attraction alone, though that had been there too, but in the deeper way of someone who had expected to receive something and found himself given something entirely different. He had expected someone manageable, and she had been real, specifically and inconveniently real, from the first week. She had learned the names of the tenants before he told her to. She had ridden the northern boundary in the second week without asking permission, and returned with accurate observations that he had not anticipated. She had sat at his table and been genuinely warm with people she had not yet met. Not the performed warmth of a woman doing her duty, but something natural and attentive that had made him watch her from the other end of the table, with the specific discomfort of a man who is learning something he had not agreed to learn. "I was afraid of it," he said. "Not of you, of what you represented. The possibility that this marriage could be something real, which would require something real from me in return, and I had arranged myself very carefully not to have to give that." She said nothing, listening. "I watched you give up the West sitting room," he said. "You did it quietly in the 3rd month, moved everything to the morning room without a word, and I knew exactly what had happened, and I said nothing. Because asking would have meant acknowledging that I had been watching, and the watching had already become something I needed to be careful about." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that I noticed everything," he said, with the directness of someone who has stopped editing himself. "The way you laughed, suddenly and without calculation, at something that genuinely struck you. The way you argued, which was precise and well-sourced and never conceded a point you were right about. The way you spoke to the tenants, remembering their children's names, their sick livestock, their boundary concerns, as though these were things worth knowing rather than obligations to be discharged." He paused. "I noticed all of it, and I called it adequate, because adequate was something I could look at, without having to do anything about it." She sat very still. "I watched you stop laughing at dinner," he said, "approximately 3 weeks before Christmas. You stopped doing it, and I knew what that change meant, and I said nothing, because saying something would have required doing something, and I did not yet know what needed to be done." "What needed to be done," she said. "This," he said. "All of this. Saying plainly what I felt, rather than performing a distance I had manufactured for my own convenience." He looked at her steadily. "The words I said to Caius were the words of a man who had spent a month knowing he was in love with his wife, and who was frightened enough of that knowledge to reduce it to something contemptible and call it pragmatism. It wasn't pragmatism. It was cowardice, and I knew it as I said it." She held very still. "You were already in love with me," she said. "When you said that, yes. In December, yes. You told your closest friend you intended to tolerate me, while feeling that. Yes. No hesitation, no qualification. I told him that because I was frightened, and because reducing what I felt to something managed and small and convenient seemed, at that particular moment, like the only way to continue functioning." He paused. "It was one of the uglier things I have done." She stood up. She crossed to the window and stood there, her back to him, her hands clasped in front of her. She thought about a year of trying to be enough for a man who had spent that same year afraid to admit she was already more than enough. She remembered the conservatory and the brown roses and the careful dinners and the afternoon she had decided to be adequate, and how that decision had produced in her a lightness that she had mistaken for strength when it was actually grief. She thought about November, which had been gray and cold, and she had been arguing about drainage, and she had not known she was being watched. "I need you to understand something clearly," she said, without turning. "I am not simply going to accept an explanation and an apology and allow things to return to what they were. What they were was not good enough. I have spent this entire first year accommodating a marriage that was asking nothing of either of us, and I am not willing to do that again." "I know," he said. "I need you to choose." She turned to face him. Not with the correct words. Not with a managed expression of remorse that produces a comfortable domestic arrangement and changes nothing in practice. Something real. Something I can see and believe, and that costs you something, genuinely. She held his gaze. "Because I am standing here, telling you that I love you, and I have loved you since considerably earlier than November, and I need to know that the man across from me is choosing me publicly and permanently, and without the management, not because it is the decent thing to do, but because he wants to." He looked at her. "You love me," he said, and it was not a question. "Since the 3rd week of our marriage," she said. "Since the evening you told me my opinion on drainage was charmingly misguided, and I spent the entire dinner working out my rebuttal and realized at the end of it that I had been thinking about you for 3 hours." She paused. "I am telling you this now, so that you know the stakes are not only yours. I have as much to lose here as you do, and I am telling you that I choose to lose it. I am asking you to do the same." He was quiet for a long moment. She continued. "I came to this house and tried in the ways I knew how. I gave things up without being asked, made myself smaller, and told myself it was patience when it was actually fear. And then I heard 2 sentences in a corridor, and I decided that being adequate was at least honest, and I stopped trying. And in stopping, I found out who I actually was without the trying, and she was someone I preferred." She looked at him. "What I'm asking is for that woman to be the one you are choosing, not the one who gives up the West sitting room without comment, the one who argues about drainage and paints at the window with the better light and does not make herself small for anyone's convenience. That one." "That one," he said without hesitation. "That is exactly the one." "Then tell me so," she said. "Not just now. Every day that it is true." He held her gaze. "I know what choosing looks like," he said. "I have known since the morning I watched you through the study window and thought, there she is, and then spent 6 months telling myself I was mistaken. The question was never what to do. The question was whether I was brave enough to do it." He paused. "I think I have been frightened long enough." She looked at him. "Then be brave," she said. "Now, and tomorrow, and the day after." He decided. He came to the morning room 2 mornings later and said, without preamble, that he had written to her father. She looked up from her painting. "I told him that his daughter had been inadequately served in the first year of this marriage," he said, "and that the fault was mine, and that I intended to remedy it with full transparency about what had gone wrong and why." He paused. "I told him that I had treated a genuinely capable woman as a function of the marriage, rather than as the person she was. That I had been aware of this, and had chosen it for convenience. That he deserved to hear that plainly." He looked at her. "I did not ask your permission first. I acted on the understanding that you had asked me to choose something real, and this seemed real. I am telling you now, so you are not surprised." She set down her brush. "What else did you say?" "I told him I intended to spend considerably more effort on being a husband worth having, and considerably less on being a correct one." He paused. "He may make of that what he wishes." She stood. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the grounds. The thaw had progressed noticeably in the past week. The lake dark and fluid now at the edges. The lawns beginning to show the first faint green at the roots of the grass. "He will come," she said. "I expect so. I told him he was welcome whenever he wished." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was standing in the center of the room, with the studied ease of a man who has made a decision and is prepared to live with it. And she thought about a year of opposite ends of tables, and careful distance, and adequate, and about the morning room window in November, and the drainage argument, and the fact that he had been watching for longer than she had known. "Caius is coming," she said. "Yes, this afternoon. I asked him because he was in the East Library when I said what I said, and I want him to hear from me, in my own house, what I actually think, not as a formal statement, simply as a fact that he should have." He paused. "And because I want you to hear me say it in front of someone who knows both of us well enough to understand what it costs." She turned to face him fully. "Say it now," she said. "Before he comes. To me first." He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she was aware of him, with the specific attention that had been growing since a carriage ride in November, when she had first noticed the inch of space between his hand and hers. "I love you," he said, plainly, the way he said true things, without elaboration and without performance. "I have been in love with you since November of last year, at the very latest, and probably earlier than that. Though I was working so hard not to notice that I cannot identify the exact beginning. I told Caius I would tolerate you 1 month after I had already understood that tolerating you was not going to be possible. I said it out of fear, and it was wrong, and I have been sorry for it, since the morning you moved your painting materials out of the room with the good light, and I watched you do it and said nothing." He paused. "I am choosing you, publicly, permanently, without the management, not because it is correct, but because you are the person I want, and I have spent 12 months being afraid of that, and I am done." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and kissed him, in the morning room, in the full light of day, with the painting board on the table, and the thawing lake beyond the window, and no pretense, and no performance, and no inch of careful distance. Not the conservatory, which had been true but provisional. This was chosen. She was choosing it, and she wanted him to feel the difference. He did. She could tell from the way he held her, not the formal, managed correctness of everything that had come before, but something that understood it was permitted to be real. The arms of a man who had stopped being afraid of what they were holding. When they separated, she looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, and he looked back, and neither of them needed to say anything more, which was in itself a kind of answer to the question of who they were becoming. When Caius arrived that afternoon, he came to the drawing room and found them on the same settee, which was the first time in 12 months this had happened. He stood in the doorway and was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something and was genuinely relieved to see it. Then he sat down in the chair across from them and looked between them with 20 years of friendship operating behind his eyes. Evander said, without any management, "I want to say something in front of you that I should have said the morning after you heard me say the other thing. I was wrong about everything I said in that library. I have been in love with my wife since before I said it, and I said it because I was afraid, and I have spent a year being afraid. And I am telling you now because you should know, and because she should hear me say it in front of someone who understands what it costs." Caius looked at Marin, then back at Evander. "I owe you an apology, Duchess. I heard what he said, and I didn't think carefully enough about what it would mean if it reached you. You told him to make certain he had what he thought he had," she said. "That was enough." "Barely," Caius said. "Yes," she agreed, "but barely was sufficient." 3 things happened in the fortnight after Caius Thorne came to Stormvale. Her father arrived, not in fury, but in the quiet manner of a man who had received an honest letter and came to see what honest letters produced. He sat with Evander for 2 hours. When he came to find Maren in the conservatory, he asked one question. She said yes. He nodded and embraced her, and said nothing further, because her father had always understood that some things only required one word. Florian Voss sent a note to say he had given up the lease on Chetwell Park. She read it and set it in the grate. And Evander moved her painting materials back to the west sitting room. He did it himself, without telling her in advance, so that she came in from her morning ride to find the board at the window, with the light she had always preferred. He was in the doorway when she turned. "The light was always better in here," he said. "Yes," she said. "It always was." They were learning each other, not the managed version in which she had memorized his surfaces and called it knowledge, but the actual process of discovering what another person was made of when they stopped performing. He was funnier than she had known, with a dry, specific humor that arrived quietly after the moment and was better for it. He was warmer with his tenants than he appeared at a distance. He had opinions about Italian painting that he had never mentioned, because no one had suggested they would be welcome. He came to the conservatory some evenings, without ceremony, and they occupied the same room without talking, and the silence was entirely different now. Not an absence, but a shared thing. She was still angry, at intervals. She thought she was entitled to that, and he did not ask her to apologize. On those evenings, he simply looked at her, with an expression that said he knew what she was thinking, and was not going anywhere, and after a while she found that this was enough. On a morning in late February, he came to find her with his coat on. "The north drainage," he said. "I thought you might want to come." She went. They rode out across the estate together in the February light, the ground soft now and beginning to breathe after the long freeze, and she told him what she thought, and he listened and agreed with one part and argued the other, and she argued back, and somewhere in the second field she heard herself laugh, the sudden, unstudied kind, and he looked at her, when it happened, with the expression she had seen for the first time, by candlelight in the conservatory, and she understood it now for what it was. "I have been reading the agricultural reviews," he said on the way back, "since November, when you mentioned the rotation trials at dinner, and I didn't know enough to respond. I did not want to not know enough." She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, because some things did not need to be said to be heard. That evening she found him in the conservatory, which had become, gradually and without discussion, the room where they said true things. He was looking at the new rose canes she had planted in January, which were just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of green at the tips. "They are coming," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about which version of me is real." She waited. "All of them are real," he said. "The man who managed from a distance, and the one who was afraid, and the one who said something unforgivable to his oldest friend. But the one I intend to be is this one, the one who tells you what is true and does not manufacture distance, and chooses you every day in full view and without the management." He paused. "That is the version I am choosing to be. Not because it is required of me, because it is who I actually am when I stop being afraid." She reached across and took his hand, and he held it. And outside the conservatory glass, the Stormvale grounds were dark and quiet in the winter night, and somewhere at the edges of the lake, the ice had given way entirely to water. 2 years later, Maren stood in the entrance hall on an afternoon in January, watching snow fall through the high windows. She was thinking about corridors, about one specifically, and pale winter roses, and 2 sentences that had unmade her, and then, at considerable cost, remade her into something considerably sturdier. She thought about this the way you thought about the worst thing that had happened to you once you were far enough from it to see it clearly, with the complicated gratitude of a person who understood that the wound had been real, and the healing had also been real, and that you needed both to arrive where she had arrived. Evander came to stand beside her, still carrying a letter from the study. "You are thinking about the corridor again," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" You get a particular expression, angry and grateful at the same time. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking that I almost did not stop. I might have walked past that door without stopping, and the rest of the year would have been different. Better, perhaps. No, worse. I would have gone on trying to be adequate, and you would have gone on managing from a distance, and we would have arrived eventually at some comfortable equilibrium and called it a good marriage and been entirely wrong about what good meant." She paused. "The worst thing that happened to me in this house was the beginning of everything real in it. I have made my peace with that." He folded the letter and set it on the hall table. "I think about November," he said. "Watching you through the study window. I think about knowing then and doing nothing for 6 months. You did something eventually. Not nearly soon enough." She reached up and touched the scar along his jaw, the one she had learned the history of from his sister. "We are here now," she said. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and she understood this about him now, that he said some things without words, and that she had learned to listen for them. From the drawing room, she could hear Petra's voice, telling someone with conviction that the snow would last until Thursday. She took Evander's hand. He held it with the ease of a man who had stopped calculating the gesture, which was all she had ever wanted, and they went to join their family in the warm room, and outside the snow fell on the south-facing wall, where the roses she had planted in October were sleeping, waiting for spring. Some loves were not easy, and were worth it precisely because of that. She had learned this in a corridor, holding flowers, and she would not have changed it. She was, finally, simply herself, and that was more than enough. If this story found you at the right moment, then you already understand what it was really about. Not a marriage saved by one grand gesture, but one rebuilt by small, true ones. The painting board moved back to the window, the drainage written out together, the hand taken, not for anyone watching, but simply because it was wanted. Subscribe and ring the bell, because there are more stories waiting here, more loves that had to break before they could become real. Thank you for being here.